Welcome to Uncover the Human, where every conversation revolves around enhancing all the connections in our lives.
Whether that's with our families, coworkers, or even ourselves.
When we can be our authentic selves, magic happens. This is Alex Cullimore.
And this is Cristina Amigoni.
Let's dive in. Hello and welcome back to this episode of Uncover the Human. It's just Cristina and I today. We are back with an episode that feels like it's just kind of timeless, something that's ever important in life, and that is the idea of feedback. Giving feedback, getting feedback, and general importance. So, Christina, you kind of thought of this as a good topic to go blast out on the airwaves. What inspired you to put this one down?
Well, as you said, this is pretty timeless. We're always, in a way, receiving feedback in one way or another, and sometimes it feels more like criticism, and it's not constructive. And so it was kind of thinking back, like, I don't think that we actually talked about feedback and what it's like to give meaningful feedback, why it's necessary to give and receive feedback, but also why it's also even more necessary to know how to do it and do it in a way that's helpful and not destructive to the person.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. And I think there's a lot to unpack between what is meaningful feedback and what's non-meaningful feedback, because we are getting feedback at all times. You can just open any social media app and read through the comment section if you'd like to see what feedback looks like, usually delivered in less productive ways. There's plenty of ways to put opinions out there. So if you're thinking about the difference between something that's meaningful and something that's maybe less meaningful, what are the first things that come up for you?
Well, I would say meaningful feedback. First of all, it's timely, and I know we talk about this when we talk about the how to give and receive feedback, and how to make it useful instead of destructive. I think the timing is definitely needed. It's much harder to receive feedback weeks or months or days after the fact. I'm like, oh, remember when 6 months ago you did this? Well, that was a failure. That's not helping anyone. Besides maybe, and not even, I was going to say maybe helping the person that's verbalizing something that apparently they carried with them for days, weeks, or months. And I'm sure that ended up well for their own lives and everybody dealing with them. So it's not helpful for anyone, the person carrying the feedback and not actually verbalizing, and the person hearing it, because as much as we would like to, we don't have a time machine. And so going back in time and doing things differently or apologizing or trying again, it's not possible. And the other piece is because it's so far in time sometimes that you can't even understand the tangible part of it. So what does this actually apply to? Like which part of the presentation, or which part of the work product, or which part of the meeting? Like how did I actually show up that was not valuable? And we don't have that memory. Most of the times we're not going to have that memory to figure out, let's pinpoint the actual, what we're talking about, as opposed to the generalization of, well, that was not useful.
Mm-hmm. I think that's an important one, and it doubles down. Like if you don't address that soon, or don't address that in a timely manner, it can develop into a habit, which can both be harder to change for the person that you're asking to change if they actually do want to change it, and also can build resentment if you feel like you felt like you need to give the feedback, on the first instance of this behavior, and now you're 10 instances down, and you feel like it's just you've started to build a story in your head that this is an intractable part of their personality. They have no idea it's happening. And then that comes to blows in unhelpful ways, and then we don't have the ability to immediately address and change that. And like you said, we don't have a time machine. We can't undo all of the built up both habit and resentment that might be present on either side of that equation. As well as we just surprise the person, and now they're like, "Well, shoot! So for 6 months, you've been thinking that I was doing this," or like, "Damn, like I didn't know that was happening."
Yes, exactly. There's not much people can do. They can do something at that moment, but it takes a lot more effort. Now, the energy that it takes to undo the assumptions that were created when there wasn't even an opportunity to even know that there were assumptions there, it's a lot more effort, and the impact is much, much greater.
Mm-hmm. When we talk about this, we have the acronyms GET and GIVE in our classes that we were talking about giving feedback and getting feedback. And let's talk first about the giving one, since we're on that one. We have that split out into an acronym for GIVE, and that is growth oriented. So making sure your feedback is an opportunity for growth, making sure it's framed in a way that it can be supportive for the recipient. And the whole point is to help change behavior because this will create a better outcome in the future. So you are looking for that growth. Second one is I for I statements, using things like I notice or I feel in your feedback so that it doesn't feel like a universal assault. And it also just comes from a point of opinion and self. And so you've done enough work when you're giving feedback to know what your feelings on this are and what you're noticing, what your observations are. And it helps it just come from rather than a place of universality. Everybody knows that you do this. It's more I notice this is happening in a meeting, and it doesn't it can maybe lower the amount of shame that can be created or defensiveness that might come up. Then there's the V, which is venue. So thinking about the time and place. This one's the timeliness one we're talking about, like getting close enough to the incident or behavior so that it's understandable as well as it doesn't build into anything else, and understanding the place. Maybe calling somebody out in public is not the safe thing to do. Unless you have a team that's very trusting and everybody knows this is feedback given in actual support of growth, in which case, that might be something that can be addressed in a meeting, and it's probably not even going to feel like feedback and not going to need a full structured give conversation to get yourself into that mindset. It's just common at that point. But if it's not common, like it isn't for most relationships, and especially while relationships are building, and especially in organizations where safety is still being built, which is most organizations at some level, then it's important to find that neutral location and not be calling people out and making sure you're doing this in a safe place and safe venue. And the final part of the acronym is E for focusing on the event and not the person, focusing on the behavior that they did and not attacking them as a person. This isn't a characteristic that they have so much as a behavior they exhibited
Yeah.
at least one time and perhaps can be changed, not because they are a bad person and did a bad thing. They just happened to make a mistake or something that was unproductive in the moment.
All very necessary thing. Apparently, I'm allergic to feedback because I have to keep sneezing. Or at least I'm allergic to bad feedback. I'm allergic to criticism. That's probably what I'm allergic to.
That's a good distinction too. There's criticism and there's feedback, and I think that that's worth diving into because first of all, this is a good set of things to keep in mind. This give idea is a good set of things to keep in mind for giving actual feedback, for having constructive criticism, they call it. I think that's a hard term to sell just because it still has the word criticism in
Yes.
it, but just it is more constructive feedback, something that is I think somebody had called it in some paper somewhere feed forward because it's about moving forward,
Yes.
not back.
Yes.
And that I think is important. So the second portion, and I think that for me translates immediately to criticism, is
Mhm.
when it's somebody whose opinion, I mean, this is going to sound bad, whose opinion shouldn't or doesn't matter. It's somebody whose
Sure.
opinion, like they're throwing it out there, and they don't have the authority. And I don't mean like
Hmm.
hierarchical organizational authority.
Hmm.
They don't have the actual knowledge
Yeah.
or know how to make the assessment that they are lobbing at you. And I think that's the other thing for me that comes up when you think about who you're going to actually take criticism from and doing that mental evaluation of is this somebody who is an expert in this field or
Hmm.
whose opinion I should or would trust if it weren't currently triggering me.
Yeah, that's a great distinction. And one of my favorite quotes, which sparked part of wanting to talk about this, is don't take criticism from somebody that you wouldn't go to advice for. And what really that means is, and it's also something that Brene Brown talks about, the Franklin Roosevelt quote, or the Theodore Roosevelt quote. It's not the critic who counts, it's the person in the arena getting their face smashed to the ground and doing the work and being out there, not the people on the sidelines just throwing the rotten tomatoes and criticizing. But I think that's the piece. It's that the criticism, if feedback becomes a criticism when it really is about either a mood or prejudgment or assumptions that were not clear or just general, just, I have to provide something because I was asked for feedback. So here it is. It's not constructive. It doesn't help anybody. It's definitely not feed forward because there's nothing tangible that you can do unless you go back in time, find a time machine, remove yourself from that situation. So maybe you're not on the receiving end of the criticism. But it doesn't take into account everything. So the ecosystem, the context, the people in the room, the objectives of what was actually done, the goals. And so getting a criticism that says something like, "Oh, you didn't hit the mark." Well, if the mark is the one that we established before this, yes, I did hit the mark. And these are the reasons why. So what does it mean you didn't hit the mark?
That's a great clarification. And that's one that I want to add into our I when we think about I statements, like I notice, I feel, just feel the difference in the impact between somebody saying you didn't hit the mark versus I feel you didn't hit the mark. Like
Hmm.
if I feel you didn't hit the mark, now we have a conversation. Now we have a,
Yes.
okay, so what didn't feel like it hit the mark about it? Where are we going? You didn't hit the mark is just, hey, you messed up. Like to quote one of my favorite quotes, you're bad, you should feel bad. It's just it
Yes.
leaves you in a pit and there's no coming out of it. And it doesn't leave you any room for explanation. It's just making sure you're there. And so that curiosity mindset I think is incredibly important. Like you
Hmm.
might have feedback, you might feel like they need to hear this because this you've evaluated their performance to need improvement. But staying curious about what is happening and what can be improved about that is a part of both the I statements and being growth oriented. And if you get too much into the judgmental statements or too much into the this is the unhelpful, unproductive states,
Hmm.
then it's easy to fall into that criticism. And you're not only not going to get what you want out of the feedback that you're giving, you're creating a bit of a dent in the relationship, which I think is something that people inherently know when they avoid feedback. They're worried about hurting the relationship. And that's the point of tools like these is to remember the importance of giving it and try and put it in the best structured way possible to illuminate that this isn't about the person. And
Hmm.
if it is about the person or if it is about the relationship, it's yeah, I guess that's going to take a hit on the relationship anyway.
Yes. Yeah, indeed. I think the other distinction between feedback or feed forward and criticism is that sometimes, or most times, maybe criticism is not done to your face. So you're not actually in the room. So it's really gossip. Because when
Mm,
somebody's talking about you and you're not in the room, that's not feedback. That's just criticism and gossip. Because part of the feedback, which is why we have give and get, is that this is a conversation. Feedback is useful when it's a conversation, which means the person giving the feedback and the person receiving the feedback are both parties in what needs to be done and what needs to be discussed. But if the person that receives the information is not in the room to even ask for clarifying questions, to ask for examples, to ask how things could have been done better, to ask what's the mark. If I didn't hit it, let's establish what the mark is. To work together and co-create a better way that things could have been or can be the next time. Whether it's something that is repeatable, then there is a next time. Even if it's not repeatable, provide if we look at feedback as a chance for providing an opportunity for somebody to grow, then it really doesn't matter that they don't grow in front of us. It's just this is helpful for you in life, maybe, or for you in your job. So, which is what we do with our kids, I think, as parents, quite a bit. It's like when we see them do something, it's like, hey, it's not okay to blank, and it may not be targeted to a specific event in the future that may or may not happen. It's more about here's a piece of growth potential that you may not be aware of. And if I ask you if you brushed your teeth and then you tell me yes, but it's clearly that you didn't, I feel like now I have to check on you. And how much does that translate into other situations with your teachers or with somebody else? So this is a moment where I can provide the feedback because it's about you and I provide it to you. If I go and tell my kid, hey, I can't believe that Alex doesn't brush his teeth in the morning, it's not helping anyone.
I'm going to continue to not brush my teeth because I have no idea.
Exactly. And I'm sure Alex brushes his teeth in the morning.
I do, and I'm glad we've cleared this out for all listeners. That is a really important point, though, but tying that to the context of why it's important to give this feedback. Not only do you have your internal mindset that this is growth oriented, but you have a chance to establish some of those connected dots for other people too. And of course, just like authenticity and just like being curious and just like coaching, you do have to do this in a genuine way because people are going to have their sensors out to hear this as non-genuine. You can try and couch this and be catty about this, but if you don't point out to people, if you point out to people like, I just really think this would help you in other portions of your life, as long as you can come across as genuine in that, that is helpful. If you say it like I just said it, that's going to come across as a
Yes.
little bit talking down. But if you say like, hey, look, it's important that you do things like brush your teeth. This is, just how you present in the world, and or hey, if I have to check in on this, it's kind of it doesn't allow me to have trust in you, and not having
Hmm.
trust is going to make it much harder for you to have relationships. It's easy enough to teach those lessons to kids. Well, it's not so easy, but we at least understand the consequences of it. And doing that with peers can feel much more difficult in the workplace when we're like, yeah, I don't know if I have that relationship. We don't always feel like we have the authority to do so. Sometimes we get too invested in there being like, well, that should be their manager giving them that or something, some unnecessary hierarchy where we could just be delivering something that helps somebody, and we could
Yes.
give them the context of why we think this would be helpful for them. And that also gives them the chance to evaluate it and decide whether that's something they
Hmm.
actually want to take to heart.
Yes.
Maybe we missed the context. Maybe we were wrong. Maybe they did that, and it seemed out of character, but they did that for a set purpose that they knew.
Hmm.
They understood what was important about you know exuding X behavior that they wouldn't do otherwise, or they don't feel otherwise. They just knew it was important in that moment. Somebody's fighting more than they seem like they would. Okay, well maybe they know why they're doing that. Maybe they're having a bad day. Maybe it's just something that comes up, but that gives them the chance to respond to it and
Hmm.
actually decide whether that's something they want to take on board and take into account when they make future decisions.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And I think it's interesting because when you can tell, like you said, like it's you can pretend to care, but it doesn't go very far. But if you do care about somebody's growth, we're all human, which also means we're all perfect and imperfect at the same time. Is in like we're not gonna get everything perfect. That's not possible. All of us know that deep down. While we do try to find perfection, and we do, and it does feel hurting. It does hurt when we're told we're not perfect. We also know that that's the truth because we always have room to growth. And so one of the biggest pieces I think that's helped when you get to that relationship piece of like this is about me and my growth is when you ask for feedback, and almost immediately or as part of that conversation the question is turned around, which is about it becomes more about like, hey, how do you think that went? You now have the chance to actually show the humanity and be honest about your own performance and say like, hey, like I thought that the beginning went really well, there seems to be quite a bit of energy in there, and then it kind of went off the rails halfway through, and not sure why. I have some theories, but it shows that we are all humble and also can be very self-reflective, and we're not expecting to just be told, oh, you were perfect, couldn't have been better than that. We know we're not perfect. We know when we don't show up perfectly. We can read the energy, we can read the room, we can read the situation and know when things are great and when things are not so great. And so diffusing the situation by asking what the person receiving the feedback thinks first about themselves then opens the door for the giver to then confirm or say like, oh yes, I've noticed this, and maybe it could have been this situation, but it becomes a completely different conversation than I'm going to talk about you badly to somebody else.
Yeah, that not only can hyper accelerate your own growth in accepting that humility, it also accelerates the growth of that relationship. That person now knows you're willing to kind of go to them for advice or trust. You trust their opinion on this. That'll build the relationship, and it's a lot easier for them to give the feedback if you've solicited it. And these are definitely good relationship builders, and the ability to both build the trust on both sides, and you will grow faster as a person because we're not going to be perfect, but we can grow.
Yes, exactly. And that's not to say that something like what happens in 360s, where somebody else is giving feedback about a person and not to them directly, needs to be eliminated. There's value in that too. But part of a good 360 is also when the receiver can go back and ask for clarification. So the receiver can actually finds enough useful information to then go back and want to have a conversation about it and understand, oh, okay, I understand where this is coming from. I can understand the context. The ecosystem was taken into account. There are some suggestions that are very clear on what I could do better next time, or how I could show up differently next time. So there is value in that because it is hard to give direct feedback. And so you want to create the space in a 360 type of environment where I am evaluating somebody while they're not specifically there, with always still the give in mind of this needs to be useful. This can't just be about criticizing who somebody is.
Hmm. Yeah. And we do have all just kinds of antenna for listening for whether that does feel genuine or not. And that doesn't mean that even when it is genuine, it doesn't like take us aback. We might still get defensive. We might still feel like it's still sometimes hard to take that feedback, even when it is delivered in the kindest way possible and trying to give all the growth orientation, trying to do all of these things well. It can still be just hard to hear feedback. We it is hard to
Yes.
accept that we messed up, or especially because we don't have time machines, we can't fix it, and we do want to do better. And it can be just difficult, and we're not we can't mitigate those things, but it will definitely go off the rails if we can detect something that is disingenuous about how it's coming across.
Yes. Well, and something that's not useful, something that you can't do anything about it.
Yeah.
Because it becomes it's either so general that there's no tangibility to it, so it's not, you can't actually figure out how to do something different next time because it's not tangible. And so the only thing that you can think about doing next time is removing yourself. And I'm like, well, clearly, this is about failing, 100%, and it's so vague and intangible that the best solution is for me to not be there.
Yeah. Yeah. And those are the things that I think tiny wedges like that happen all the time in the corporate world. And so there's a lot of continually growing chasms when we don't bridge that, when we can't reach back across. And when we're like, oh well, I don't know that they knew the full context, but I don't have any ability to provide that. And I don't want to come across as like making an excuse or something. And then we drift farther. That kind of brings us to the receiving end of feedback.
Mhm.
What do we do when we get those feedback? When we get feedback and decide whether we want to take that on board or not, what we're going to do with it. That's where we have the acronym that we teach in our classes of GET. G for gather context, gather understanding, like really hear out the full feedback, understand the context of it, gather whether that's, if it's something that was happening with other people or that's a long-term pattern. Maybe it's about talking to other people and figuring out what other people notice than just the person who's giving the feedback. Ask clarifying questions, decide whether this is something that or understand the full context of what is being said and whether it's, for lack of a better term, true. It's hard to
Mhm.
decide truth. We all have to decide what's whether it's true enough that it's something we want to take into account and do something with. And that brings
Mhm.
us to E, which is evaluating our options, deciding what actions, if any, we're going to take when it comes to feedback. And that is when we're really doing that discerning of, is this somebody that I should trust their opinion of? Would I ask them for advice?
Yes.
Would I ask them for advice? Is this the right kind of feedback? Are they taking it out on me as a person? Do I feel like they have my best interest in heart? And do I feel like that's fair criticism? Now that I've gathered some context, if I have some other opinions, if I'm vulnerable enough to ask people whether this is true and whether this feels like it's something that would is coming across maybe differently than we even expect to or intend to. And once we've done that, we really evaluate whether that's something to take on board. And that brings us to T, which is taking action. And those actions might be just going back to the person and being like, yeah, I hear what you're saying. Here's the context of kind of why that happened, and here's why there's not really something for me to address here going forward, or here's why I don't think that's something I can take on right now, or I don't think it's important for me to take that feedback. I think it's more important to do whatever your original intention was, or whether it's, oh, I hear what you're saying. I want to work on that. Here's what I'm doing to go do that, and going
Mhm.
having that follow up with the person. If it didn't come across as like somebody just coming out to slight you just to slight you, then it
Mhm.
is a follow up conversation. And it is going back to say, is this? Hey, here's what I'm gonna do. Here's what I've heard from you. Here's what I understand of it, and here's what I'm doing about that.
Yeah, those are very valid points, and it does include all those elements of getting past the initial threat of the feedback. Nobody wants to be told that they're not good enough. That's really what feedback sometimes can feel like, or all the time at the beginning it feels like you're not good enough. While we all know we're not perfect, we all want to be perfect. So that's the other side of the coin of hearing that we're not perfect. Which, it goes much deeper into the need for humans to belong, and receiving feedback that says that you're not perfect, or that could potentially say that you're not perfect. It means like, oh, now the tribe is going to reject me. If the tribe rejects me based on our basic human needs, I'm now in danger because I'm now alone and abandoned. So if we unpack everything that could happen with the feedback, that's why it's hard to receive feedback. The more you do it, the more it's a muscle. And especially when it is given, uh, and it's constructive and it's feed forward, then you can, it's easier to then build a get muscle on getting the feedback. The discernment, it's huge on, is this constructive? Does this help me? Is this person somebody I would ask advice to? And does this take into account everything that needs to be taken into account, or is it a very narrow view? The other piece I think that's also very important is it's back to feedback versus criticism, which is this just about defending myself, or is it about helping improvement? And if we're not helping growth and improvement, then why are we talking? And why should we receive that? So on the get side, if this is not about improvement and growth, then is it worth spiraling over?
Hmm. And it's okay then to process the feelings of spiraling and the whatever anger or whatever that will come up with that, and just acknowledge that this was unfortunate, and that naturally hurt, and it's okay to move on without taking that on board.
Yes.
And this is where it gets challenging, since so many people have just different reactions to feedback, and those are all fed to us by both our just general personality and our experiences with feedback. I grew up in a household where there was a lot of, one of the rules was like no talking back. If you can't clarify anything, and you can't say, oh, this wasn't right, or hey, I don't think that's
Mhm.
fair, then you just kind of get used to whatever feedback comes your way. You just have to take it, because there's no recourse. And if you do talk back, then you're making excuses. Then you're now have a new character flaw of, now you're making an excuse, you're not taking responsibility, whatever it is. That's my experience, and that becomes very difficult to receive feedback when it feels like something where you're like, okay, I just have to take it. It doesn't matter what is said. I'll just absorb that, and I'll
Mhm.
just try and do the best I can with that information. And that then spirals into ignoring all those discerning features of like, is this something that I should take on?
Mhm.
Should I be listening to this person? And that really wears those muscles, or it doesn't develop those muscles. And everybody has different reactions and different defenses and different things that they feel like, is it some perfectionism? Is it some specific angle of perfectionism where, maybe work is a really important thing to you, or you feel like it's really important. And so being perfect, or perceived as perfect, or at least not being not good enough, is important and really triggering, and feels really hard to take in feedback, even if you can take feedback in other ways, in other areas of life. Maybe work is really
Mhm.
triggering. Maybe whatever comes up for you, there's going to be your own individual flavor of reaction, and your own individual flavor of acceptance of giving, or avoidance of giving feedback. And those are okay. But we have to be aware of those, and we have to
Mhm.
still aim for the things we want to do better.
Yeah, and you touched on something that's huge, which is the awareness. Self-awareness when we're both giving and receiving feedback, it's huge. Which goes back to when we're giving feedback, the self-awareness of, is the feedback that I'm giving really about what happened, about the thing, about improvement, about growth, about whatever, or is it about a button that got pushed in me? Was there a button that got pushed and whatever happened? And so my way to diffuse my own spiraling is to then criticize somebody else, is provide feedback that's neither constructive, it's not helpful, it's not directly to the person, but then it's in the hope of me feeling a little bit better about whatever I was triggered. So having that self-awareness is huge. On the receiving end, it's the same piece. It's like when you were receiving the feedback, it's having the self-awareness to determine, like, is this, what buttons are being pushed in this feedback? And are these buttons because of this situation, or is it history? And also, are the buttons valid? Because if we see the world the way we are, not the way the world is. So everything is subjective. What's being received and what's being heard and what's being given, it's completely subjective. What we need to try and discern in there is what can help the future, because we still don't have that time machine to go back in the past.
Mhm. Yeah, I always like to joke about that internally with myself, where I was like, well, I could dedicate the rest of my life to time travel and see if I can go back and unwind this one mistake, or I can try and I can try and just do better from here.
Yeah.
And it is hard to get to that level of acceptance. But that is another part of things like timeliness. Like, it is important to give timely feedback, but also that might involve you taking the moments to process whether, like you said, this is something that just pushed a button for me. Is this
Yeah.
something that I actually need to deliver as feedback, or am I feeling a little pushed and I need to push back? And my first instinct is to push back. If that's the case, then maybe it's worth it, like not just the time to wait until you're out of a public situation, but the time to decide whether is this just something that I'm reacting to that I don't actually need to react to in this way, or at least it's not
Mhm.
feedback that I need to give them. Or is this something that really does need to be addressed? And both can be true. They might be true that a button was pushed and it needs to be addressed. Also, because you're in a state then where a button was pushed, you might need a moment before you can deliver helpful feedback.
Yes, yes. Well, and also I think establishing what the feedback is about. So are we speaking the same language? Because most of the time that's, that could also be on different rails. It's like I'm expecting feedback about the objectives and whether we reach them, and you are providing feedback about who I am as a person. We're not on the same page. First of
Yeah.
all, don't provide feedback to people who are as people unless you really want to burn that bridge. But also, like, are we talking about the same thing?
Yeah.
Because then that's also when things could really go wrong, both from the giving and receiving, if we're not actually establishing that we're talking about the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah, those will derail things so quickly.
Yes, yes. And it's especially in the corporate place. I was on the receiving end of criticism. I wouldn't call it feedback. On criticism that I was glad that because it was an HR, it became an HR matter. It was that there was investigation to the truth of it. Because if the HR department or the executives had actually just gone with the opinion of the person that gave the criticism, I probably would have lost my job. So it did take the curiosity, which is a big piece to go in, of understanding like, okay, this person is saying this, great. Now, with a blank page, let's go with curiosity to investigate, to ask other people. Do you see the same thing? What do you see? What is your experience? And then gather all the data and understand, like, okay, this seems more like it's valid because seems to be very common and people are using the same words and same examples, or this is more about one person dealing with something and taking it out on somebody else.
Yeah. As it reminds me just the importance of the like innocent until proven guilty versus guilty until proven innocent. It's sort of the assuming positive intent. And it helps to codify some of those things. And it can be really, scary and stressful, especially in something like an HR complaint or something. Or if there's an investigation, like it's helpful when like it's going to turn up good evidence. It's going to turn up
Mhm.
like, yeah, this they do need to do this digging, and it's still stressful to do those things. But it is important to kind of have that mentality of let's assume the best from this person. They probably, even if they stepped on a button, they probably weren't aiming
Mhm.
for it.
Yes. Or maybe the button has nothing to do with them at
Hmm.
all. They were just a scapegoat.
Yeah. And if it does, do you need to what are your next steps? Is it better
Mhm.
that you step out? Is it better that you don't have this relationship? Is it better you address it and then see how things go? And that's all totally fair. All of those options are fair and then
Yeah.
worth the investigation and worth it to yourself to take the time to decide and to feel
Mhm.
comfortable with and to feel out and to feel what's safe.
Yeah. Exactly. Anything else for feedback?
Yeah, I think that's our feedback.
I know. I know. We do have some post feedback advice. So
Hmm.
after the feedback, so let's assume that it was a good prep to the feedback. It was actually feed forward. There is validity to the feedback. It was about the thing, not the person. Done all those things like it was given and with the right timing and all the context and with suggestions. It was received, past the emotional initial reaction, but there is curiosity on both ends. The post feedback is to really talk about what's going to happen for now, from now on, because that's really what it is about. If we're giving feedback again, hopefully it's about improvement. And so, offering support if we're the ones giving feedback, offering, clarification time if, or time to go back and like, hey, as things come up, feel free to come back and ask me for clarifications, providing examples. But also on the receiving end is committing to like, yes, I've heard this. Is this what you mean? And this is what I would like to do to improve next time. And then establishing that accountability. How will that come through?
Agreed. Yeah, those are all great tips for what happens post feedback and what you can do to really prove that you are in the growth oriented mindset,
Yes.
providing examples, helping follow up, making sure that there is a space for people to follow up with you. Like that is commitment to the actual growth.
Yes. So good luck with your feedback.
Good luck. It's always
Make sure
challenging.
it is always challenging. If you ever need to talk, we're here. Thanks for listening.